The Light in Maple Grove, a novel of memory, second chances, and quiet hope. Chapter 1, Quiet Mornings, excerpt. The coffee pot gave a soft sigh before sputtering to a stop, filling Harold Benson's kitchen with the smell of fresh brew and a hint of loneliness. He poured himself a mug, the same chipped blue one Ellen used to tease him about, and shuffled toward the porch in his slippers. Outside, the morning light slid across the cornfields like a soft golden tide. The air was cool, the kind that carried both the promise of another day and the quiet ache of too many yesterdays. The house behind him was too quiet. Even the refrigerator hummed gently, as if afraid to disturb him. The walls still held the faint scent of Ellen's lavender cleaner, though she'd been gone 5 years now. Sometimes, if he stood still enough, he could almost hear her humming in the kitchen. He eased into the porch chair that creaked under his weight and took a slow sip. "Another fine day in Maple Grove," he muttered, half to himself, half to the sparrows that darted along the fence. It wasn't that he disliked the quiet. He'd earned a bit of peace after 40 years with the U.S. Postal Service. He'd seen his share of barking dogs, icy sidewalks, and Christmas rushes. But peace had a strange way of turning into stillness, and stillness into something heavier. At 9 o'clock sharp, he drove into town for breakfast at Lou's Diner. Same booth, same order: scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee. "Morning, Mr. B," said Judy, the waitress who'd been there nearly as long as the linoleum. "You're up early. Must be big plans today." "Big plans." Harold grinned, just hoping to survive the crossword. She chuckled and topped off his coffee. "That's ambition enough." From his seat, Harold could see the library across the square, the same red brick building he hadn't stepped into in decades. The morning sun caught on its tall windows, one of which glowed brighter than the rest. Funny, he thought. Some lights stay with you longer than others. Chapter 2, The Girl at the Library. The morning light on the library window lingered in Harold's thoughts long after he'd left Lou's Diner. He drove the long way home, past the park, the grain elevator, and the old high school that now stood half empty, its football field sprouting weeds. Somewhere between the sound of his tires on gravel and the slow rhythm of the wipers clearing a fine mist from the windshield, a memory rose up, clear, sudden, and uninvited. It was the summer of 1968, and the world had felt enormous. He was 21, lean as a fence post, with a buzz cut that hadn't quite grown out from his last visit to the barber. The town had one main street, 2 gas stations, and a library that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. He'd gone there one afternoon to escape the heat, still wearing his apron from the hardware store. That was when he first saw her. Margaret Clark, the new librarian's assistant. She was standing on a step stool, shelving books with calm precision. Her hair was the color of wheat and kept falling forward as she worked. Every time she pushed a strand behind her ear, he forgot what he was supposed to be doing. When she looked down and caught him staring, he pretended to study the spines of the books nearest him, gardening manuals of all things. She smiled anyway. "Looking for something in particular?" she asked. Her voice carried that soft confidence that made people listen. Tomatoes," he said, grasping for the first thing that came to mind. "Growing 'em, I mean." She stepped down from the stool and walked over, barefoot in her sandals. "Then you want the beginner's garden companion. 3rd shelf down. Though personally, I think beans are more forgiving." "Beans, huh?" He grinned. "You sound like you've done this before." "I read a lot," she said simply. "It counts for something." He visited the library 3 times that week. By the second visit, she already knew his name. By the third, she'd asked about his plans after the hardware store closed for the day. They spent that July walking by the creek, sharing bottles of cola, talking about things that seemed big then: music, the war, what they wanted out of life. She wanted to teach English someday. He wasn't sure what he wanted, only that it might be easier if she were part of it. One evening they sat under the gazebo in the park as the streetlights came on. The air smelled of lilac and cut grass. She brought a worn copy of a poetry book, Robert Frost, and began to read aloud. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep," she read softly, her voice mingling with the chirp of crickets. Harold tried to pay attention to the poem, but all he could see was the way the light caught her freckles. He almost said it then, "I love you," but the words felt too large, too dangerous. Instead he said, "That's a fine poem." She laughed. You didn't listen to a word, did you? He blushed. Not all of it. Well, she said, closing the book, maybe next time. But next time never came. The letter from the draft board arrived 2 weeks later. He told her on a sweltering afternoon outside the hardware store. She was carrying a paper bag of books, and the wind kept tugging at the edges. How long? She asked quietly. Basic training starts in September. After that, who knows? She looked at him for a long time, eyes bright but steady. Write to me, okay? Promise you will. I will. He meant it. He wrote the first night in camp, but the letter came back stamped undeliverable. She'd moved, he never knew where. He thought about her often while overseas, especially during quiet nights when the stars above the jungle looked like Indiana's. He'd imagine her in that library, still reading poetry, still tucking her hair behind her ear. When he came home 3 years later, he saw her at the grocery store with a man he didn't recognize at first, George something, a banker from the next town. Margaret's hand rested lightly on the man's arm. She saw Harold and smiled, that same kind smile, though her eyes seemed distant, as if she were looking at a memory. Welcome home, she said softly. Good to be back. And that was all. Now, sitting in his truck in 2022, Harold could still recall that look, kind, grateful but closed. She had built a life without him, and he had gone on with his own. Still, the thought of her reading poetry in that same library window stayed with him, like a candle that refused to go out. The rain had stopped. He turned the key, the engine coughed to life, and he drove home wondering, not for the first time, why some memories grow brighter the older you get. Chapter 3: Letters Never Sent. The rain came back that evening, a steady whisper against the roof. Harold sat in his recliner with the TV on low, some game show flickering in the background. He wasn't watching it. His eyes kept drifting toward the hallway closet, the one he'd been meaning to clean out since Ellen passed. He finally stood up, muttering, "Might as well make a dent in it." The closet smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Behind a row of old coats and photo albums sat a cardboard box marked in Ellen's tidy handwriting. Keep. The word gave him pause. Ellen had been practical, not sentimental. If she'd written keep, there had to be a reason. He carried the box to the dining table and opened it carefully, half expecting to find the smell of her perfume trapped inside. Instead, there were mementos of a life well lived. Family pictures, birthday cards, a church bulletin from their 40th anniversary. At the very bottom lay a bundle of envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on them wasn't Ellen's. Harold's breath caught. The ink had browned with age, the paper thin as onion skin. On the first envelope, the return address read Margaret Clark, Maple Grove Public Library. He sat down slowly. The first letter began, "Dear Harold, I never knew how to say goodbye at the bus station. You looked so calm and I couldn't find my voice. Maybe that was my mistake." He read it twice, hardly blinking. The letters continued, each one dated months apart during his first year overseas. Margaret had written about the town, about the summer reading program, about how the library windows steamed up in the humidity. She'd written that she missed their walks, that she still had the Frost book they'd shared. In one, she confessed, "I keep meaning to mail these, but something stops me each time. It feels foolish to write to a man who might not even remember me. And yet I do it anyway." Harold set the letter down and rubbed his temples. Ellen must have found them years ago, maybe tucked into an old desk drawer when the library was remodeled. She hadn't mentioned it. She'd simply kept them. He wasn't sure what to make of that. He rose and poured himself a small glass of the good bourbon, his thinking drink, as Ellen used to call it. Outside, thunder rolled over the fields. "Why do you keep them, Ellie?" he said aloud, voice rough. "Were you trying to tell me something? Or was it mercy?" He imagined her answer in the warm, teasing tone he knew so well. "Because they were part of you, Harold. And I loved all the parts of you." He smiled faintly through the ache. The next morning, he read every letter again, slower this time. He could almost hear Margaret's voice, gentle, careful, never demanding. In her final letter, dated 1970, she wrote, "I think I'll stop writing now. George asked me to marry him and I said yes. But I want you to know that in another life, maybe the one we both dreamed about by the creek, I would have chosen you first." By the time he finished, The sun had climbed high and the clock read nearly noon. Harold folded the letters neatly and placed them back in the box. He sat at the table for a long while, staring out the window at the fields shimmering with morning light. So many years had passed. Ellen was gone. Margaret was who knew where or if she was even alive. And yet the words on those pages felt fresh, almost living, as if they'd been waiting all this time for him to finally open them. He thought about calling Beth, maybe telling her what he'd found. But something in him said no, not yet. This was a private conversation between the man he used to be and the man he'd become. Later, when the afternoon breeze picked up, Harold carried the box out to the porch. He didn't know what to do with it. Throwing it away felt wrong, keeping it hidden felt heavier. Finally, he slid the letters into a clean envelope and wrote on the front, in his neat postal script, "To be read when ready." He placed it in the drawer beside his chair, next to his Bible and Ellen's old crossword book. Then he brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat watching the sky shift from gray to blue. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stirring. Not quite sadness, not quite joy. Something like possibility. Maybe it wasn't too late to open a few more doors. Chapter 4 Visit from Beth. Saturday mornings used to be noisy in the Benson house. When the kids were little, Ellen would be in the kitchen flipping pancakes while Harold tried to read the paper over the commotion. The smell of syrup and coffee, the hiss of bacon, the sound of laughter. That was the music of a home alive. Now, Saturday mornings were quieter. But this one was different. Beth was coming. Harold's daughter called the night before, her tone brisk as always. "Dad, I'm driving down in the morning. We need to talk about a few things." "Few things," Harold repeated afterward, setting down the phone. "That can't be good." He spent the next morning tidying up the living room. Not because he cared about appearances, but because he knew Beth would. He vacuumed, dusted the end tables, even rearranged the magazines so the headlines faced the same way. Ellen used to say he only cleaned when he was nervous. She was right. At 10 sharp, the sound of tires on gravel announced Beth's arrival. She stepped out of her SUV, sunglasses perched on her head, clutching a reusable coffee cup and a tote bag full of paperwork. At 47, she was the image of her mother, same brown eyes, same determined chin, but with a modern edge that made Harold feel about 100 years old. "Hi, Dad," she said, hugging him quickly. "You look good. Thinner, maybe. Lost a few pounds wrestling raccoons out of the garbage," he said. She smiled faintly. "You're impossible." They went inside. She glanced around approvingly. "House looks nice." "Thank you kindly," he said, taking her coat. "Want some coffee?" "Sure. Just a splash of milk if you've got it." As he poured, he noticed her scanning the shelves, the old family photos. She picked up one, Ellen holding baby Mark, with Beth at age 5 sitting cross-legged at their feet. "You know," she said softly, "I still remember Mom humming while she made biscuits. I can almost smell them when I look at this picture." Harold smiled. "She used to say the trick was cold butter and patience. I've got the butter part down." Beth laughed, then sighed and sat at the kitchen table. "Dad, we should talk about you. About this place." He groaned inwardly. "Here it comes. Don't make that face. I'm serious. You're alone out here. The winters are rough and you're not getting any younger. There's a community just outside Indy, the Willows. They've got nice apartments, activities, a shuttle to the grocery store. You'd have people around." "I've got people around," he said, gesturing toward the window. "There's Frank 2 doors down and Judy at the diner. Even the mailman waves sometimes, when he remembers I'm alive." "Dad," she said gently, "you know what I mean. You could make new friends. You could be near us. The kids would love seeing you more." He looked at her, really looked. The worry lines around her eyes weren't just for show. She wasn't scolding him, she was afraid for him. He felt a tug of guilt and love all at once. "I know you mean well, honey," he said quietly, "but this is home. I built the porch myself. Your mom planted that oak out front. Every board in this place has a memory nailed into it." Beth reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "I get that. I do. But memories can travel with you, you know." He gave a small nod. "Maybe so. But I'm not ready to pack him up just yet." She sighed, smiling despite herself. "Stubborn as always." Runs in the family. They let the conversation drift to lighter topics. Her job, the grandkids' soccer games, the neighbor's new dog. She showed him photos on her phone, swiping through with practiced ease. Harold admired the pictures, but couldn't help noticing how foreign all the technology felt. When did the world get so fast? After lunch, they took a slow walk around the yard. The oak tree rustled overhead, scattering acorns across the driveway. Beth touched its trunk. "You planted this the year I started kindergarten, didn't you?" "Sure did. Your mom picked it out at the nursery. Said it'd give us shade someday." "Well," she said, looking up. She wasn't wrong. They stood there for a long moment. The wind smelled like hay and wood smoke, the scent of home. Before she left, Beth hugged him tighter than usual. "Just promise me you'll think about what I said. Maybe go out more. Join something. Anything." "I'll think about it," he said, which was true, though not in the way she meant. After she drove away, Harold sat back on the porch, listening to the crickets start their evening chorus. The conversation had stirred something in him, a restlessness he couldn't quite name. He looked across the fields toward town, where the faint outline of Maple Grove's main street shimmered in the setting sun. And there it was again, that light in the library window glowing softly through the dusk. He leaned back, smiling to himself. "Join something, huh?" he murmured. "Maybe I just will." Chapter 5: The Library Light. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles, thinking about Beth's visit. Join something. He could still hear her voice saying it with that mix of affection and exasperation that only daughters seem to manage. The next morning dawned mild and bright, the kind of September day that almost makes you believe summer might hang on a little longer. Harold poured his coffee and wandered onto the porch. The fields shimmered in the distance, the air carried the smell of cut hay, and somewhere a tractor started up. He thought about mowing the lawn but decided against it. There was time for that later. Instead, his eyes drifted toward town again, to that faint glint of red brick and glass he could just make out in the distance. The library. By 10 o'clock he was in his truck, heading down the familiar road. The old building looked just the same as it had when he was young, tall arched windows, the carved stone sign reading Maple Grove Public Library. Established 1904. The flower beds out front were freshly mulched, and a bicycle leaned against the railing. He hesitated at the entrance. "Don't be ridiculous," he muttered. "It's just a library." Still, he took a deep breath before pushing through the door. Inside, the cool air smelled of paper and polish, exactly as he remembered. Only now, computers stood where the card catalogs used to be, and the checkout desk had a little bell that blinked instead of ringing. "Good morning," called a cheerful voice. Behind the counter stood a young woman with chestnut hair pulled into a loose bun. Her name tag read Emily Carter, librarian. "Morning," Harold said, doffing his cap out of habit. "Didn't expect to see such a fancy setup. Back in my day, we used index cards and pencils." Emily laughed. "We still have a few of those around. The computers just make it easier to lose things faster." He chuckled. "Sounds about right. I used to come here a long time ago. Thought I'd see what it's like these days." "Well, you picked a good day. It's quiet, except for story hour in the children's room. Can I help you find something?" He hesitated, feeling oddly shy. "I was thinking about poetry. Maybe Frost, Dickinson, something like that." She brightened. "Poetry? We've got a whole shelf of it. Right this way." He followed her past the fiction section. The place felt smaller, or maybe he'd just gotten bigger. The same high windows poured sunlight onto the wooden floors, and for a second he could almost see a young woman on a step stool, reaching for a book, her hair catching the light. Emily stopped at a shelf and ran her finger along the spines. "Here we are. Frost, Dickinson, Sandburg. You've got good taste, Mr. Benson." "Harold Benson." "Well, Mr. Benson, if you like poetry, we're actually looking for volunteers. We deliver books to homebound seniors and read to the kids during story hour. It's a fun group." He blinked. "Me? Volunteer? Sure. You'd be surprised how many folks around here appreciate a friendly face. And if you like Frost, you could read a poem or two to the little ones. They love rhythm and rhyme." He chuckled. "Not sure they'd sit still for stopping by woods on a snowy evening." "You might be surprised," she said. Kids are better listeners than most adults. He smiled. I'll think about it. Emily handed him a slim volume of Frost. Start with this one. On the house, so to speak. Thanks. I'll bring it back. Take your time. We're open late on Thursdays. That's when the community group meets if you want to stop by. On his way out, Harold paused by the front window. The sunlight glowed through the glass, catching the dust motes in the air. He remembered Margaret's laughter, the sound of pages turning, the way she'd looked at him that last afternoon. It was all so far away, and yet, standing there, he felt something new stirring in the old memory. Not regret but invitation. Outside, he lingered on the steps, book in hand. The street smelled of coffee from the cafe next door, and across the square he saw Judy wiping down tables at the diner. She waved. He waved back. That evening, as twilight settled over Maple Grove, a single light burned in the library window again. Harold sat on his porch, the book of poems open on his lap. He read aloud softly to himself, the words rolling out into the quiet. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. He closed the book and smiled. Maybe Beth was right. Maybe it was time to join something. And the library light, steady and warm against the dusk, seemed to nod in agreement. Chapter 6: The Porch Poets. The following Thursday, Harold found himself back at the library, freshly shaved, wearing a clean flannel shirt and the same cap he used to wear on his mail route. He felt faintly ridiculous standing outside the door, clutching a book of poetry under his arm. But something about the light spilling from those tall windows drew him in again, like the glow of a fire on a cold night. Inside, the small community room was already half full. A few retirees sat in a circle of mismatched chairs. There was coffee brewing on a side table and a plate of cookies that looked suspiciously homemade. Emily waved from across the room. Mr. Benson, you made it. Didn't want you thinking I was all talk, he said, easing into an empty chair. That's the spirit. Everyone, this is Harold Benson, retired postal worker, poetry enthusiast, and as of today, our newest volunteer. Welcome aboard, said a white-haired man in suspenders. I'm Clyde. Used to run the hardware store until the chain store put us out. I remember, Harold said, shaking his hand. Bought a lot of paint thinner from you back in the day. Then I thank you for your service, Clyde chuckled. To his left sat a woman named Jean, a former second-grade teacher, and beside her a quiet man named Robert, who spent most of the meeting sketching in a small notebook. They all looked ordinary enough, but as Emily began the introductions, Harold realized each had a story. Jean had lost her husband 3 years ago. Clyde was caring for his wife with dementia. Robert had moved back to town after decades away. The talk turned to books: Frost, Whitman, Mary Oliver. They read lines aloud, stumbling here and there, laughing when someone mispronounced a word. Emily kept the tone light, asking questions, coaxing memories. When it came to Harold's turn, he hesitated, flipping through the pages of his well-worn Frost. I've always liked this one, he said finally. Mending wall. My wife and I used to joke about it when the neighbor's fence kept falling down. He read slowly, his voice unsteady at first but growing stronger with each line. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. When he finished, the room was quiet for a beat. Then Clyde said, Guess that's a fancy way of saying neighbors ought to talk more. Exactly, Harold said, smiling. We spend half our lives building fences and the other half wishing we hadn't. Jean nodded. That's why we're here, isn't it? To tear a few down. Emily grinned. Well said. Maybe that's what we'll call ourselves, the Porch Poets. A place to sit, talk, and listen. And just like that, they had a name. Over the next few weeks, the Porch Poets became a fixture at the library. They met every Thursday, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes just talking about life. Their grown children lost loves, the ache in their knees, the funny things you start to notice when you get older. Harold discovered he had a knack for storytelling. Clyde said he could listen to him spin yarns all night. He even began delivering books to a few shut-ins around town. One was Mrs. Talbot, who lived 2 streets over and made the world's driest oatmeal cookies but insisted he take a dozen every visit. Another was a veteran named Frank, mostly blind, who liked to sit on his porch while Harold read the sports page aloud. One afternoon, after a round of deliveries, Harold stopped by the library just as Emily was closing up. "You're doing great, Mr. Benson," she said, stacking a pile of returned books. "Everyone keeps asking when you're reading again." "Reading?" he said, pretending surprise. "I thought I was just here for the cookies." She laughed. "You've got a good voice. Steady. People trust that." "Well," he said, a little embarrassed, 40 years of reading addresses will do that." She smiled. "I think Ellen would have been proud." He looked at her then, startled. "How'd you?" "Beth mentioned it," she said softly. "She stopped by last week with some old photos for the library's history board. She talks about you like you hung the moon. You know?" Harold swallowed the lump in his throat. "She got that from her mother. Always seeing more in me than there was." Emily tilted her head. "Maybe you're finally starting to see it yourself." He chuckled and changed the subject. "You're good at this, getting people to talk." "It's easy," she said. "You just have to listen for the stories under the stories." That night, back on his porch, Harold watched the sunset fade to blue. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt earned, like a pause between verses, the kind that makes the next line mean more. He thought about Margaret, about Ellen, about the walls and fences time builds between people. Maybe he thought those walls weren't meant to last forever. Maybe they were just waiting for the right moment, or the right poem to come tumbling down. As the first stars appeared, he smiled to himself. "Porch poets," he murmured. "Has a nice ring to it." And in the window of the library across town, the light still burned, steady and welcoming, like a promise he hadn't realized he'd been keeping all along. Chapter 7: Echoes of the Past. October came to Maple Grove softly that year, brushing the trees with bronze and gold. The air held that sharp sweetness that only autumn can bring: wood smoke, fallen leaves, and the faint tang of apples from the farmer's market down the road. Harold loved the season. He liked sweaters, the smell of rain on pavement, and the way the fields went quiet after harvest. But this fall felt different. Maybe it was the porch poets. Maybe it was the way the library had come back into his life. For the first time in a long while, he felt connected. On Thursday evenings, he read aloud to the group, his voice steadier each week. Clyde would bring a thermos of coffee. Jean baked muffins. Emily always had a new poem to share. They talked, laughed, sometimes cried. They were a mismatched bunch, but something about those meetings filled a space Harold hadn't known was still empty. One afternoon, while shelving books after the meeting, Harold noticed a dusty binder labeled Maple Grove History, 1960 to 1980. Curious, he opened it. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, school events, local weddings, community notes. And there she was, a photograph of Margaret Clark and George Whitmore wedding, June 1970. He ran a thumb over the black and white image. Margaret stood beside George in front of the First Methodist Church, smiling the kind of polite smile you give a camera, not the person you love. He felt an old ache stir, gentle but insistent. Emily appeared beside him, balancing a stack of books. "You found the archives," she said. "Careful, they're addictive." He showed her the photo. "She worked here once. Margaret Clark. We were friends. Long time ago." Emily studied the picture. "She looks kind." "She was," he said quietly. "Haven't thought about her in years, at least not until recently." Emily hesitated, then said, "I think her husband's family still owns a place over on Elm Street. The big white one with the lilacs." Harold nodded slowly. "I remember." That evening he couldn't shake the thought. The next morning he drove down Elm Street, parking across from the old Whitmore house. The lilac bushes were gone, replaced by trimmed hedges. The porch railing had been painted bright blue. He sat there a while, engine idling, watching a young couple unload groceries. Finally, an elderly woman came out to check her mail. Harold stepped from the truck, tipping his cap. "Excuse me, ma'am. Did Margaret Whitmore ever live here?" The woman squinted. "Oh yes, dear. Margaret and George. Lovely folks. George passed some years ago, and Margaret must be 10, maybe 12 years back. Cancer, I think." Harold's breath caught. "I see," he said softly. "Thank you." "She was a sweetheart," the woman added. "Used to read to the school kids every Thursday. My granddaughter still remembers her voice." He thanked her again and returned to his truck, sitting in silence. He wasn't sure what he expected, to see her stepping onto the porch, perhaps waving with that easy smile. But the house belonged to another life now. He drove to the park instead, their park, and parked beneath the old gazebo. The boards creaked when he stepped inside. The benches were chipped with age, initials carved deep in the wood. He sat down and looked out across the empty playground. The memory came easily, unhurried. Margaret's laugh, the sound of her voice reading frost, the soft brush of her shoulder against his. All of it felt so close he could almost reach out and touch it. "Guess we both kept our promises," he murmured. "You built a life. I built one too. Not the same one maybe, but a good one." He stayed there until the shadows lengthened. A few teenagers wandered by, earbuds in, oblivious to the old man sitting quietly with ghosts. That night at the library, the porch poets gathered as usual. When it was Harold's turn to read, he chose something simple, Mary Oliver's In Blackwater Woods. His voice trembled slightly on the closing lines. "To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go." When he finished, the room stayed still for a heartbeat. Then Jean reached over and squeezed his hand. "That was beautiful, Harold," she whispered. "That's what it's all about, isn't it? Learning to let go." He nodded, blinking back the sting in his eyes. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Letting go, but not forgetting." Later, as he locked the library doors for Emily, he glanced up at the tall windows glowing in the dark. The reflection staring back was older, slower, but lighter somehow, like a man who'd finally set something down after carrying it too far. He touched the glass lightly, as though offering thanks to the woman who once read poetry by that same window, and whispered, "Rest easy, Margaret." The night was cool when he stepped outside. Across the square, the diner lights flickered on, and the bell above the door jingled. Life went on the same, yet not. Harold walked to his truck, the crisp air filling his lungs, and felt strangely at peace. The past had spoken, not to wound, but to remind him that love, even unreturned, could still bless the years that came after. Chapter 8: The Reunion Letter. 2 weeks passed after Harold's quiet visit to Elm Street, and something inside him began to settle. He found a peace he hadn't known he was missing. A kind of stillness that came from acceptance rather than absence. But it also stirred something new, a need to reach out. It started one afternoon when he opened his mailbox to find a crisp white envelope addressed in careful, looping handwriting. Maple Grove High School Class of 1965 Reunion Committee. He chuckled softly. "Good grief," he muttered. "They're still doing those?" Inside was an invitation. "You're cordially invited to the 60th reunion of the Maple Grove High School Class of 1965. Saturday, November 12th, at the VFW Hall." He stood there a long moment, the autumn wind rustling the edges of the letter. He hadn't attended a reunion in decades. The last time he'd been invited, Ellen was alive and they'd both agreed to skip it. "Too many memories," she'd said, half teasing, half true. But now, something about it called to him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the thought of seeing faces from the past, to measure time not in regrets but in stories shared. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, the invitation beside a cup of tea gone cold. The porch light threw a golden circle on the paper, and before he realized it, he'd pulled out a sheet of stationery and begun to write. "Dear Beth, got a letter today from my high school reunion committee. 60 years, imagine that. I almost tossed it, but then I thought maybe I shouldn't hide from the past anymore. Funny how long we carry things without realizing their weight. I've been helping out at the library these days, reading to kids, delivering books, even joined a group we call the Porch Poets. You'd like them, good people, lots of laughter, some pretty good pie. I learned recently that Margaret, the woman your mother used to tease me about, passed some years back. I thought it would hit harder, but it didn't. It just felt finished, like a song you still hum sometimes, but you don't need to replay anymore. Anyway, I'm thinking of going to that reunion. Not to chase ghosts, but to see who's still around, maybe say thank you to a few people I never did. Your mother always said I'd regret keeping quiet. Maybe she was right. She usually was. Love, Dad." He folded the letter carefully and set it on the counter. Beth had been calling more often lately, short conversations but easier somehow. The edges between them had softened. The next day, he told Emily about the reunion while helping her stack returned books. "You're really going to go?" she asked. "I think so. Might be nice to see some old faces. Remind myself I didn't just pop out of nowhere." She smiled. "You'll be the star of the night, I bet. The poet of Maple Grove." He laughed. "More like the mailman who still can't dance." "Take pictures," she said. "We want proof you had fun." When the evening of the reunion came, the VFW hall was lit up like Christmas. Rows of folding tables, banners strung across the walls, a big paper sign that read, "Welcome back, Class of '65. The scent of potluck casseroles and coffee filled the air. At first, Harold hung back by the punch bowl, unsure of what to do with his hands. Then someone called his name. "Harold Benson, you old son of a gun." And suddenly he was surrounded. There was Mike Jenkins, who'd once thrown a baseball through his father's window. Susan Fry, the cheerleader with the same silver blonde hair. Even old Coach Reeves, stooped now but sharp-eyed as ever. They talked and laughed, comparing aches and grandchildren, trading stories about who'd moved away, who'd come back, who'd left the world behind. Later, when the chatter eased, Harold wandered to the display board at the back of the room. It was covered in photos, yearbook portraits, old snapshots, wedding announcements. His eyes stopped on one picture. Margaret again at a school fundraiser, smiling beside a table of books. Beneath it was a note, "In loving memory of Margaret Whitmore, volunteer, teacher, and friend." Next to her photo was another, Ellen, his late wife, helping at a bake sale, flour dusting her cheek. Someone had written "Always the Heart of Maple Grove" under her name. Harold stood a long while, looking between the two faces, the first love he'd never had, and the great love he'd been blessed to share. It struck him then how both had shaped him, not in competition, but in quiet collaboration. One had taught him what love could be, the other had shown him what love truly was. As the evening drew to a close, Mike handed Harold a slice of cake and said, "You should say a few words. You've got that storyteller voice." Harold laughed. "What would I say?" "Say whatever you've learned," Mike said simply. "We've all been trying to figure it out." So he stood, a little nervous, tapping his fork against his glass. The chatter dimmed. "I don't have a speech," he began. "Never was good at those. But 60 years ago, we all started out from the same place, bright-eyed, thinking we'd have it all figured out by now. Turns out we don't. And that's okay, because what lasts isn't the answers. It's the people who helped us keep asking the right questions." He paused, scanning the familiar faces. "I lost folks I loved. I made mistakes. But I've learned that love, even the kind that doesn't turn out the way you hoped, still does its work. Changes you if you let it. Makes you softer where you used to be hard. Kinder where you used to be proud." He raised his glass. "To the past that made us, the people who shaped us, and the chances we still have left." They cheered, and for a brief moment, Harold felt something lift from his shoulders. The old loneliness, the quiet ache. It didn't vanish, but it settled into something gentler, like the hush that follows a favorite song. When he returned home that night, the air was cool and clear. He stood on his porch, looking out over the dark fields. The stars seemed closer somehow. He thought about the faces from the evening, about Beth and Emily and the porch poets waiting for their next meeting. Then he went inside, poured himself a small glass of apple cider, and smiled as he sealed the letter to Beth. Some echoes, he realized, aren't meant to fade. They're meant to guide you home. Chapter 9: A Winter Gathering. Snow came early to Maple Grove that year. By mid-December, the town square looked like a Christmas card, lampposts wrapped in garland, the courthouse clock dusted white, and children in puffy coats dragging sleds down Main Street. Harold loved the hush that snow brought. The way sound seemed to soften, as if the world were holding its breath. The library, too, had changed with the season. Wreaths hung on the tall doors, and inside, someone had strung white lights across the front windows. The faint scent of cinnamon drifted from a crock-pot of spiced cider near the desk. Emily had declared it holiday week at Maple Grove Library, complete with crafts for the kids, a book drive for the nursing home, and a special reading night hosted by, to Harold's surprise, the porch poets. He tried to protest. "Now hold on, Emily. Nobody wants to hear me mumble through frost when there's eggnog around." but she'd waved a hand. "You're not just reading, Harold. You're the headliner. The people love you. You're part of the show." So that's how he found himself one snowy Thursday evening standing before a room full of neighbors, clutching his dog-eared poetry book like a lifeline. The fireplace in the reading room flickered warmly. The shelves glowed under fairy lights, and Clyde, Jean, and the rest of the porch poets sat nearby, grinning like proud co-conspirators. Emily tapped the microphone. "Thank you all for coming to our first ever winter gathering. Tonight we're celebrating community, with stories, poems, and a little music. To start us off, our very own Mr. Harold Benson will share a few words." The audience applauded gently. Harold stepped up, cleared his throat, and squinted over his glasses at the expectant faces. There were kids sitting cross-legged on the floor, older couples holding hands, a few folks from the VFW, even Judy from the diner. "Well," he began, "I'm no poet, not really. I just like the sound of words that remember things." A soft chuckle rippled through the crowd. "When I was a mailman, I used to see the whole town from my truck window, the kids waiting for letters from college, the grandmothers baking for Christmas, the same dogs chasing me down every street." Laughter again. He smiled more at ease now. "I guess what I'm saying is, back then I thought my job was to deliver mail. Turns out I was collecting stories all along. Little pieces of people's lives. Maybe that's what we're all doing. Delivering something that matters, even if we don't realize it until years later." He paused, then read from the book in his hand, Robert Frost again, of course. "The way a crow shook down on me. The dust of snow from a hemlock tree." The poem was short, barely a minute, but the room was quiet when he finished. The kind of silence that feels full, not empty. Afterward, the porch poets took turns reading. Jean shared a funny piece she'd written about her cat stealing tinsel. Clyde read a cowboy poem from memory, and Robert surprised everyone by playing the harmonica. Between readings, Emily passed around mugs of cider and shortbread cookies. The laughter rose and fell like a fire crackling. Later, when most folks had gone home and snowflakes were drifting lazily past the windows, Harold stayed behind to help stack chairs. Emily handed him a leftover cookie wrapped in a napkin. "You were wonderful tonight," she said. "People really listen when you speak." He smiled modestly. "Guess I've had a lot of practice talking to myself over the years." "Don't sell yourself short. You've got a gift, Harold, the kind that makes folks feel less alone." He didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded and slipped the cookie into his coat pocket. Outside, the air was cold enough to make his breath visible. The square shimmered under a new coat of snow, every roof gleaming like silver in the streetlight glow. He heard laughter down the block, teenagers throwing snowballs, the faint jingle of a bell from the diner door. When he reached his porch, he brushed the snow from the rail and sat down for a moment, listening. The night was still, save for the distant hum of wine through the trees. He thought of Ellen and Margaret, and all the people who had filled his life in their own ways. He thought of Beth, who would be coming home for Christmas in a week. And then he thought of the library, of that circle of light in the middle of town, full of laughter and life, where he'd somehow found his way back to belonging. He reached into his pocket and broke the cookie in half, smiling at its uneven edges. "Not bad, Benson," he said to the quiet. "Not bad at all." Above him, the stars were sharp and clear, and for the first time in years, he felt the simple joy of being exactly where he was meant to be. Chapter 10: Beth's Christmas Visit. December deepened in Maple Grove, and the town wore its holiday cheer like a soft blanket. Snow lay thick on rooftops and sidewalks, and the scent of pine and cider seemed to linger everywhere. Harold's little house was no exception. He had strung lights along the porch, placed a small evergreen in the corner of the living room, and even dug out the nativity scene that Ellen had insisted on displaying every year. Beth's car rolled up the driveway mid-morning, packed with suitcases and holiday cheer. Harold leaned on his cane, squinting through the snowflakes. She waved, the same determined smile from the fall, only brighter with the promise of the holidays. "Hi, Dad," she called. "Looks like someone's been busy decorating." "Try not to trip over the tinsel," he said, huffing a laugh. "It has a mind of its own." Beth stepped out, hugged him, and held on longer than usual. "I've missed this place," she said softly. "You too," he replied, feeling the warmth of home in a way he hadn't for years. Inside, the house smelled of pine, old wood, and the faint hint of cinnamon from the cookies cooling on the counter. Harold showed Beth the porch poet's handmade ornaments he'd hung on the tree, little paper stars and painted pine cones. "Made by the gang at the library," he said. "Jean insisted we add glitter. I'm still finding it in my slippers." Beth laughed, shaking her head. "Leave it there. Let it be a reminder." After lunch, they sat by the fireplace. Beth shared stories of her kids' school plays and hockey games, showing photos on her phone. Harold listened, nodding, occasionally interjecting with a dry remark about how kids today were both fearless and reckless in ways he'd never imagined. Eventually, the conversation softened. Beth looked at him earnestly. "Dad, I've noticed a change in you. Since the library, since the porch poets, you seem lighter." Harold smiled quietly. "I suppose it's easier when you realize you're not carrying the past alone anymore. I found my people again, Beth. Folks who listen, who laugh at my jokes, who remind me that life still has moments worth showing up for." Beth nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'm glad. Really glad. And I'm glad you stayed in Maple Grove. I see now why this place means so much to you." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and thick, blanketing the yard in white. Harold and Beth stepped onto the porch for a moment, taking in the quiet beauty. He handed her a cup of hot cocoa. "You know," he said, "your mother would have loved seeing all of this, the porch poets, the library, even me being part of a reunion. She'd be proud." Beth squeezed his arm. "She is. And so am I." Later, after dinner, the two of them decorated cookies for the neighborhood kids. Harold's icing lines were crooked, but Beth didn't mind. When a few children from the block arrived, Harold read them a poem aloud, his voice steady and warm. They listened, some fidgeted, some smiled, but in that moment, the house felt full again, alive with laughter, wonder, and the soft pulse of connection that had been missing for so long. As the night drew to a close, Beth helped him clear the table. The fire had burned low, the tree lights twinkled, and the snow outside muffled the world beyond the windows. Harold sank into his chair, tired but content. Beth came over, sitting beside him. "Thank you, Dad," she said, "for keeping the lights on for me. For everyone who loves this town." Harold reached over, resting his hand over hers. "The lights were never really off," he said softly. "They were just waiting for someone to notice them again." And in that quiet glow, Harold felt the fullness of a life well lived. Memories treasured, love remembered, and hope quietly renewed for the days still ahead. Maple Grove, the library, the porch poets, and Beth's laughter. It all blended together like a familiar song. And for the first time in a long while, Harold closed his eyes and smiled, at peace with the past, present, and all the possibilities the future still held.